Hola a todos y bienvenidos al MOOC, Curso Básico de Lengua y Cultura Españolas, Nivel 2. Welcome to the Basic Spanish Language and Culture Course, Level 2. Soy Vijaya Venkatraman, soy tu profesor de español para este curso online. En este video vamos a hablar de Gabriel García Márquez y otros escritores latinoamericanos del periodo conocido como el boom. In this video, you will learn about Gabriel García Márquez, the Colombian writer who was also known as Gabo or Gobito by friends and fans. And we will also talk about the other three writers, Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Julio Cortázar, who were associated with the period called the boom. And we'll also talk about a literary style that is associated with Gabriel García Márquez, that is magical realism. You will also learn about how magical realism offered possibilities for writers and other parts of the world to speak about and for all the people who are marginal to history, who have not had a voice. Gabriel García Márquez was born in Aracataca, and his most well-known works are The Funeral of Mama Grande and Other Stories, published in 1962, 100 Years of Solitude, published in 1967, Autumn of the Patriarch, published in 1975, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, 1982, The General in His Labyrinth, 1989, and finally his autobiography, Living to Tell the Tale, that was published in 2002. The other important writers are Julio Cortázar, who was an Argentine writer and who lived between 1914 and 1984. And he was the oldest of these four writers who comprised what is known as the boom period. He is considered one of the most innovative and original authors of his time, a master of poetic prose and the short story. He is also known as an exponent of fantastic literature, not literature as fantasy, but the fantastic incorporated in everyday aspects of reality through breaking down the temporal linearity associated with the realist novel. His most important work is Hopscotch, published in 1963. Carlos Fuentes from Mexico, a contemporary of García Márquez, who lived between 1928 and 2014, and whose important works are The Death of Artemio Cruz, 1962, and La Región Más Transparente, Where the Air is Clear, 1958. The most recurring features in his works are the recovery of history, the relationship between power and politics, and an in-depth analysis of Mexican society. Mario Vargas Llosa, a Nobel laureate from Peru, who was born in 1936, is the youngest writer of this group. His works of renown are Time of the Hero, 1962, The Greenhouse, 1965, and the monumental Conversation in the Cathedral, 1969. He is a prolific writer cultivating an array of literary genres, including literary criticism and journalism. His novel includes comedies, murder mysteries, historical novels, political thrillers, and many of his films have also been adapted into cinema. His works are influenced by the writer's perception of Peruvian society and of his own experiences as a Peruvian. Before we proceed further, we will talk about some of the writers who were also writing in the same period but were considered as precursors to the boom. These were Miguel Ángel Asturias from Guatemala, known for his Men of Maize and the Banana Trilogy, the Peruvian José María Arguedas, who is known for his intimate portrayals of indigenous Andean culture and creating a new language blending Quechua and Spanish in novels like Yavar Fiesta, Deep Rivers, and The Fox Above and The Fox Below. Another writer who had a very important influence on this generation, not only in Latin America but all across the world, is the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, who mainly wrote poetry, short stories, and essays, who was born in 1899 and died in 1986. Now, what exactly was the boom? The Latin American boom was a literary movement of the 60s and the 70s, when the work of these relatively young Latin American novelists, whom we have mentioned before, became widely circulated in Europe and throughout the world. They drew their influence from European and North American modernism, from writers like James Joyce and William Faulkner, but it was also influenced by the Latin American avant-garde movement, which sprang from surrealism but adapted it to the Latin American context. Their work were highly experimental and political, owing to the political climate of Latin America of the 60s. Spanish publishing houses like Seis Barral also played a role, promoting their literature and leading to its internationalization. Let us talk about the political context of the boom. The 1960s and the 70s were decades of turmoil all over Latin America, in a political climate strongly influenced by the dynamics of the Cold War. This climate formed the background of the work of these writers and defined the context in which their radical ideas operated. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 and the subsequent US attempt to thwart it through the Bay of Pigs invasion can be seen as the start of this period. Cuba's vulnerability led it to closer ties with the USSR, resulting in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the US and USSR came dangerously close to nuclear war. Throughout the 60s and the 70s, military authoritarian regimes ruled in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and many other countries. In Chile, the coup d'etat led by Augusto Pinochet against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in 1973, the dirty war in Argentina, in which thousands of citizens were tortured and disappeared, and many of these dictatorships received support from the US in terms of help and in terms of torturing and eliminating political opponents and disposing of their bodies in what was known as Operation Condor. Let us now talk about the literary style of the boom writers. As we said earlier, the boom writers used experimentation as a means to challenge established literary conventions. Time is treated as non-linear. The use of the unreliable narrator or multiple narrators offer multiple perspectives of the same reality. They experimented linguistically, blending the vernacular seamlessly, coining new words, using puns and even profanities. Other notable characteristics of the boom include the treatment of both rural and urban settings, internationalism, an emphasis on both the historical and the political, as well as questioning of regional as well as or more than national identity. The literature of this period questioned the barriers imposed between the fantastical and the mundane by realist writers and sought to blend the two, offering a new vision of reality. Of the boom writers, Gabriel García Márquez is most closely associated with the use of magical realism. Indeed, his short story, The Funeral of Mama Grande, is considered the finest example of this kind of writing. Gabriel García Márquez was born in Aracataca in 1927 and spent his early childhood not with his parents and siblings, but in the big house of his maternal grandparents, Nicolás Márquez Mejía and Tranquilina Iguarán Cotes. It was a house full of people, grandparents, aunts, visitors who would come and go, guests, servants, Indians, but also full of ghosts. Years later, it continued to obsess him even when he was not there, and the memory of the house can be seen recreated in many of his literary works. García Márquez fondly described his grandfather, whom he called Papalelo, as his umbilical cord with history and reality. His grandfather was an excellent storyteller and taught García Márquez lessons from the dictionary, took him to the circus each year, and was the first to introduce his grandson to ice, a miracle found at the United Fruit Company store. García Márquez's grandmother, Doña Tranquilina Iguarán Cotes, too played a very significant role in his upbringing. He was inspired by the way she treated the extraordinary as something perfectly natural, and normal. According to Garcia Marquez, she was the source of magical, superstitious, and supernatural view of reality. And he enjoyed his grandmother's unique way of telling stories. No matter how fantastic or improbable her statements, she always delivered them as if they were the irrefutable truth. It was a deadpan style that some 30 years later heavily influenced his most popular novel, 100 Years of Solitude. As a young man, Garcia Marquez left his studies in law school and became a journalist. That was primarily to earn a living. Garcia Marquez did not care for labels and always resisted attempts to slot his works as magical realists or otherwise. He insisted, rather emphatically, that all the events and characters of his work were deeply rooted in the real world. In fact, he repeatedly asserted that the fact that literature, politics, and journalism could not be considered apart, and he said that from journalism I have got my political consciousness, and political consciousness, as we all know, is the highest sense of reality. End of quote. The most important themes that we find in Garcia Marquez's writing are the following. The first is the theme of solitude. The imagery of solitude recurs again and again repeatedly in his writing. One only needs to remember the last few lines of 100 Years of Solitude. Solitude here is defined not in terms of a romantic loneliness, but in emphasizing the political amnesia that denied Latin Americans the possibility of national emancipation. And it is this possibility, according to Garcia Marquez, that the writer can hope to achieve through literary experimentation. Garcia Marquez has repeatedly in several interviews referred to the solitude of power, the solitude of writing, the solitude of fame, solitude that cuts one away from the reality and the real world, which he has fought hard to fight through his engagements with political journalism. As he says in an interview to the Paris Review in 1981, and I quote, "The writer's very attempt to portray reality often leads him to a distorted view of it. In trying to transpose reality, he can end up losing contact with it, as in an ivory tower, as they say. Journalism is a very good guard against that." End of quotation. The second theme that comes across repeatedly in his work is the fictional village of Macondo, and which was inspired by his birthplace Aracataca and the big house of his grandparents. The third issue that keeps coming up in his work is the socio-political context of Latin America and its connection with literature. As we all know, the long and violent encounter that Latin America had with the colonial Spanish Empire and then the neo-colonial powers, the US after independence from Spain, and the military dictatorships propped up by imperialist powers is the central theme that runs in his work. In his Nobel Prize speech, Garcia Marquez also describes what he calls the crux of the solitude of Latin America. The utopia created by the colonial masters must be deconstructed, and the inventors of tales with their imagination set free need to weave an opposite utopia. The violence in Colombia. For Garcia Marquez, politics was the mainstay of all art. In his autobiography that was published in 2002, he recounts the impact that the violent incidents of the aftermath of the killing of the political leader Jorge Eliseo Gaitan had on him. On April 9, 1948, the presidential candidate of Colombia, Gaitan, was shot down in a street outside his office in Bogota, and it sparked a popular rebellion known as the Bogotazo, which marked the beginning of more than a decade of civil war. The conflict drew in tens and thousands of students, urban and agricultural workers, and peasants into a battle against the oligarchy and the church. The Bogotazo kicked off a period in Colombia known as La Violencia, or the time of violence, in which hundreds of thousands of ordinary Colombians lost their lives. Now we will talk briefly about Garcia Marquez's most well-known work, 100 Years of Solitude. Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, described 100 Years of Solitude as the greatest revelation in the Spanish language since Don Quixote of Miguel de Cervantes. The novelist William Kennedy hailed it as the first piece of literature since the book of Genesis that should be a required reading for the entire human race. 100 Years of Solitude has had a remarkable trajectory. It won international acclaim almost immediately after its publication. The Prix du Meilleur Livre Étranger in France in 1969 and Italy's Premio Cinciano the same year. By 1973, it had been published in 23 countries, had sold 1 million copies in the Spanish language in 21 printings. It was brought out by Editorial Sudamericana in Buenos Aires in 1967. It had been translated into 18 languages and sold hundreds of millions of copies the world over. The fact that the two of the writers of the boom period were awarded the Nobel Prize is testament to its importance in world literature. These two writers were Mario Vargas Llosa and Gabriel García Márquez. Gerald Martin, one of the best known biographers of Gabriel García Márquez, says in his book that 40 years ago in 1982, when Gabriel García Márquez won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he appeared to have come from nowhere, like his book appeared out of thin air through some form of spontaneous third world combustion, and this was actually deadly serious, inconceivably industrious, determined writer who had worked unceasingly for 2 decades to get where he was and would be prepared to work equally tenaciously to stay there. Now we will talk about magical realism. The narrative style that has been described as magical realist came to influence writers of this generation, not only from Latin America but also from other parts of the world. For the first time, perhaps, readers confronted a style of writing where the fantastic and the magical elements could coexist with the otherwise most mundane and realistic events. According to Garcia Marquez, the problem is that Caribbean reality resembles the wildest imagination. Marquez also believed that a novelist could do anything he wanted as long as he could make people believe in it. Garcia Marquez also believed that the central problem in Latin America was that the people were creatures of an unbridled reality, and the central problem consisted in finding ways to render such a reality believable. An allegory of the history of Latin America. One could say that the 100-year time span presented in 100 Years of Solitude represents an allegory of Latin American history, from conquest to colonization to independence, progress, democracy to modern economic dependency. Garcia Marquez argues therefore for the idea that magical realism has a political function, that of the freedom of the imagination and the imagination itself as a revolutionary idea. The task of a writer, according to Garcia Marquez, is to dare to imagine an alternative and in fact a more real or authentic version of their own history and identity while seeking solidarity from the rest of the world. Realism or magic? In one of the series of interviews published as The Fragrance of Guava, Garcia Marquez maintains that realism is a kind of premeditated literature that offers too static and exclusive a vision of reality. However good or bad they may be, they are books that finish on the last page. A realist text is therefore hardly a satisfactory mode and much less an accurate presentation of the world, because disproportion is part of the reality of Latin America. Garcia Marquez says our reality is itself out of proportion. In other words, Garcia Marquez suggests that a magical realist text is paradoxically more realistic than a realistic text. Now we will talk about Cortázar and the fantastic. Cortázar introduces the idea of fantastic and breaks with rationalism by practicing his own imagination of everyday life. messing up the imposed empirical laws and creating an orderly chaos within his creative fantasy. For Cortázar, the fantastic never seemed like the fantastic, but rather like one of the many possibilities or existences that reality can present to us, when for some immediate or indirect reason we manage to open ourselves to the unexpected. That is probably where fantastic literature comes from. It is not escapism, it's a contribution to living more deeply in this reality. It is important to mention that despite what most critics thought, Cortázar's writing was deeply engaged with social and political realities. What made García Márquez one of the most well-loved writers was the versatility of his works, which I believe cannot be subsumed under the label of magical realism. It encompasses his life experiences, his understanding of his continent's political and social problems, and he wove tales of magic and enthralled readers, a man who was very ordinary, just like you and me, just like his readers, but one who made genuine literature accessible and easy. García Márquez is no longer alive, but he will live on through his books and writings. But more than anything, he will live forever in the hopes of humanity for a better world. In this video, to summarize, you have learnt about Gabriel García Márquez and other writers associated with the period known as the Boom. You've also learnt about the central characteristic of the Boom period and the major works of the time. You've also seen how García Márquez's life experiences and the socio-political reality of his continent deeply influenced his literary style known as magical realism. You've also learnt about Cortázar's idea of the fantastic. I would end this video by urging you to read 100 Years of Solitude. It is available very widely in English and it has been recently translated into Hindi by Dr. Manisha Taneja and published by Rajkamal Prakashan. I would also recommend reading García Márquez's Nobel Prize speech and his autobiography, Living to Tell the Tale, which was published in and translated in 2003. Thank you very much.